Hey, if you got a Bible, go ahead and meet me in Mark chapter 8 today. Mark chapter 8, we're going to just continue our journey looking through the Gospel of Mark at the life of Jesus from beginning to end, but specifically how he formed and transformed the life and the leadership of the people that followed him from the very beginning. We're going to be in Mark 8. We'll get to Mark 8 in just a second. I want to take just a quick second and give you a little Freeland family update with a prayer request, if I can. And I feel a little weird about doing that because I know every Sunday, ton of us walk in on a Sunday morning from a whole lot of different vantage points, and some of us carrying really, really hard stuff, but only one of us gets the microphone to ask for prayer requests. So, but there's another side to that coin. Where I feel like part of my whole job as your pastor is to follow Jesus in front of you and to invite you to come along. So we had an incredible week. You saw a little of that around here at Explosion. But I spent most of it in Oklahoma City with my family. My dad had a pretty serious stroke last Saturday morning and is really struggling to rebound from that. So we're on that weird, long, slow roller coaster ride that I know a lot of you are really familiar with. I hate roller coasters of all kinds, but especially this one. So we still don't know a whole lot about long-term prognosis or how much he's going to bounce back or what that's going to require of my mom or the rest of us, but that's the road that we've been on this week. And again, a road that I know a whole bunch of you have walked at various points. So those of you that have walked it with people that you love or individually, you know how to pray for us maybe better than we know how to pray for ourselves these days. So I didn't say anything about it last Sunday. Frankly, I just didn't know what to say, but we did talk last week about trusting Jesus to lead us even when he leads us places we don't like. And that was a lesson that was from real lived out experience in my life last week. So we're going to continue that journey this morning, Mark chapter 8. If you were here with us last week, we talked about how most of us tend to like following Jesus as long as Jesus leads us where we like, how we like, when we like. But one of the challenges with thinking about Jesus as our leader is how a bunch of us tend to think about leadership at all. The truth is, especially in our culture, we tend to think about leadership like voters. So we have a vision of the good life and what that looks like, what success looks like, what safety looks like, what happiness looks like, what fulfillment looks like. And then we look for leaders that will serve our vision of that life and represent it for us to vote for. And that even translates over for us spiritually. We tend to think of Jesus like a politician who's running for office, looking for our vote in our life. If his agenda lines up with our lives, then we're in. But if he supports the vision of the life that we're after, if we tend to like him, we're pretty happy to let him lead. But when Jesus says things like the things that he's about to say in Mark chapter 8 today, we begin to realize something about Jesus as a leader. His highest priority doesn't seem to be winning the popular vote. If you found Mark chapter 8, look down at Mark chapter 8, beginning of verse 34. I just want to read the whole section, then we'll go back and peel it apart a little bit. Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 34, says this: Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone's ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." That's not exactly the kind of stuff that you put on a campaign mailer, is it? Like deny yourself, take up your cross, lose your life. They don't feel like real vote getters. But here's the distinction, and I think it's going to keep getting clearer throughout this whole section of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is not campaigning to support our kingdom. He's inviting us to follow him into his. So I wonder if maybe we picked the wrong picture of leadership. Jesus is less like politician here, more like a guide. So several years ago, I took a group of college students to Colorado to go whitewater rafting. It had been a really good snow year in Colorado, so the snow melt was really strong. It had rained on the mountain right before we left, so all the rapids were significantly higher than normal. And we loaded up on the bus to go whitewater rafting with a guide named Bear. Bear couldn't have been much older than us. The way to the drop spot, we were all monkeying around on the bus and giving each other a hard time and joking around, and Bear fit right in with the rest of us until we got off the bus. And then everything changed about Bear. He got real serious. He put an end to all of the fun and the games and the monkeying around, and he said, look, you guys are about to experience something that most people never get to experience up here. But we're not playing around on the river. He said, I've done this a long time. I have never seen conditions like this. It's going to be unbelievable, but it will not be easy. And if you guys jack around, it could cost you your life. You need to follow me. You need to do everything that I say, even if it doesn't make sense to you, even if it all seems backwards to you from what you think you ought to do. You need to know this is serious. You do what I tell you to do, not just what you think you should do. And if you can't do it, we're not going. But if you can do it, buckle up and follow me. We're going to have the time of your life. He was leading us, but he was not looking for our vote. He was not serving our agenda. He had our long-term well-being in mind, and he knows that it's going to be worth it, but he's not messing around, and he's not looking for popular opinion, because he knows if you don't take him seriously, there are two things at stake in that moment. You could lose everything, or you could miss out on something that most people never get to experience, but that we would never want to forget. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here in Mark chapter 8. He's guiding the people who decide to follow him towards the life they've always wanted. Something that few people ever actually get to experience. But he's making sure that we know it's not always going to feel like fun and games. Like, it's high stakes, and the path that he cuts or commands won't always seem to make sense to us. In fact, he invites us to examine 4 things here that push against everything that we tend to believe about where life is found. Not to scare us, but to guide us. And to guide us even from our own good intentions and internal instincts. Because the stakes of blazing our own trail through life, or solely navigating based on our own personal instincts, can cost us more than it seems. And worse, they'll rarely guide us to the life that we're actually after. Look at the first thing that Jesus invites us to consider. It's back there in verse 34. It says, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. So let's be honest, this is one of those things that if you've been around church for very long, or if you're at all familiar with Jesus, it just kind of rolls off your tongue without thinking a whole lot about it. Like, it can be so familiar to us that we say it without thinking about how much it pulls against everything we're taught. From preschool classrooms to pop-up ads to the questionable wisdom of Tom Haverford on Parks and Rec. We live almost entirely in a treat-yourself world. We're taught from an early age to follow our own instincts, to follow our heart, to believe in ourselves. You do you, boo-boo, right? From our very first lessons in life. And it only gets more sophisticated the older we get. But the consistent message of the world that we live in is pretty simple. If you want life, look deeper within yourself and then build your life around whatever you find there. But Jesus steps on the scene here and says what seems to be the exact opposite of that. If you want to follow me, deny yourself. And at first glance, it almost sounds like Jesus is inviting us to self-loathing. Like the goal of the Christian life is to think less and less and less about yourself. That's actually not what he's saying. In fact, Jesus isn't calling you to hate yourself. He actually assumes in the Great Commandment that you have to love yourself in order to love others. So he's not calling us to pretend that our lives and ourselves don't matter. He's inviting us to decide who will be the center of gravity in our world. Who's going to be the center of gravity in my world? Whose will be my default when what I want is in question? So maybe think about it this way. There's a version of you that God made and made for a relationship with him. A version of you that he loves, that he's in the process of forming and guiding and transforming towards life. And there's a version of you that spends every waking moment trying to secure and protect and promote and justify and defend and preserve itself by itself. You could think of it as a shadow self or a false self. And that's the self that Jesus has in his scope here. That's what he's talking about denying here. It's that part of us that's constantly looking at our surroundings and asking the question, what's best for me? What's in it for me? How will this make me look? What can I get out of this? How can I get ahead or stay ahead in life? How can I make myself matter in the world or have value in the world here and now? Jesus isn't inviting you to think less of yourself. He's inviting you to give yourself the gift of living for something bigger than your shadow self. It's what C.S. Lewis said, if you're familiar with that quote. Our problem isn't that our desires are too strong. It's that they're too weak. The issue isn't that we want too much, even necessarily that we want wrong things. It's just that we're too often willing to settle for far too little without even knowing that we're doing it. Jesus isn't trying to keep us from our desires. He's trying to rescue us from a life that's too small, from a shortcut that won't lead us where we ultimately want to go. He's guiding us towards life that's really life. So think about your own life. You ever looked back at your life and realized how badly you wanted something that turned out not to matter as much as you thought? Like the relationship that you were convinced would make you happy? The promotion that you thought would finally make you feel like you'd arrived, were successful? The approval of a group of people whose names you can barely remember today? The argument that you just had to win? The purchase that you just had to make? You could see it in the rearview mirror. In the moment, it felt like life would be less forever if you were denied that desire that you had. That's what Jesus is trying to help us see here, but on an even bigger scale than that. Not because he wants less for us, but because he wants more for us than sometimes we want for ourselves in the moment. He's inviting us to stop organizing our lives around whatever feels most urgent or most desirable or important in the moment, and to start trusting the one who can see further down the road than we can. He's trying to help us avoid a rearview mirror filled with regrets, but we won't if we don't follow him, even in the moment. So he says, deny yourself, and then he says something even more unsettling right there in that same verse 34. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So a lot of times when we think about crosses, we think about a jewelry, or maybe a tattoo or church artwork. But that's not at all what the crowd that Jesus was talking to heard here. They didn't think inspiration when they heard the word cross. They thought execution. Maybe like an electric chair today. But even more visceral than that. It didn't happen in a private room in a jail with a few witnesses and a blurb in the news. It's estimated that the Romans crucified around 30,000 people during Jesus' lifetime. This was a consistent part of the roadside scenery for all of these people. It represented the ultimate worst case scenario that any of them could imagine for their life. And Jesus says, take up your cross. In other words, he's saying, if you're going to follow me, you have to settle something ahead of time. Who will get the final word over my life? Who will get the final word over my life? Because there are going to be moments, Jesus is saying, where he carries you through what you can only imagine is the worst case scenario. Where it feels like if you follow him, it's going to cost you your reputation. It's going to cost you perhaps your dignity, your victory, or maybe it even feels like it's going to cost you your life. Because that's what's really happening at a cross. A cross is where your agenda stops. and someone else takes over being king. Cross is where control over outcomes comes to die, where you're out of options, where the freedom to choose your own adventure goes away for good. And Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, don't wait until somebody else chooses your cross. Decide to take it up now. And decide who will get the final word for my life. Don't wait till the crisis to choose your cross. One thing I just keep noticing as I read this passage is the passage that happened right before it. Just Peter lurking in the background of what Jesus is saying. Peter heard suffering last week and rejection and death for Jesus and said, absolutely not. Because he's already determined that there were some roads down which he would not allow Jesus to go. Some things that Jesus would never be allowed to lead Peter through or lead Peter to. And as a result, if you know Peter's story, Peter was not ready when the crisis came for him. Peter wanted Jesus to embrace resurrection life without crucifixion surrender. And now Jesus is telling his followers in the crowd, look, you're not going to experience that either. And sometimes that looks like taking up the cross of forgiveness when we'd rather have the control of revenge. The cross of the truth when we're confident that a lie would protect us. Sometimes it means taking up the cross of trusting God with outcomes over the illusion that we can control our own destiny. And sometimes it means trusting God with an area of obedience, even a small thing where everything in us says that there's got to be another way. The cross-shaped life chooses quick surrender over the illusion of control. And most of the time, the reason we cling to control, it's not because we're arrogant. It's because we're afraid. It's because we're scared of what would happen if Jesus doesn't come through. We're afraid of what obedience might cost us. We're afraid of not getting the future that we imagine and the way we've drawn it up. And Jesus says, pre-decide to take up your cross. And remember, this invitation is before any of them have categories for Jesus' cross and the empty grave on the other side of it. He's inviting them to trust them through their worst case scenario, even before they see his ultimate victory over his. We aren't looking at it with that vantage point. You and I know what Jesus promised, what he's got the proven power to do on the other side of a cross. That makes the invitation even more sensible. Despite it being scary, take up your cross and follow me. But that leads Jesus to the next thing, because once we surrender control, the question becomes, what if I lose? And Jesus hits that head on, verse 35. He says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. For what good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? So if you're tracking with Jesus so far in what he's saying here, there's a pretty obvious objection. Like, hey, Jesus, if I stop making myself the center of the world, if I just open my hands on control of my destiny and surrender my immediate, my ultimate outcomes to God, what if I end up with less than what I could have grabbed on my own? What if it doesn't pay off here and now to follow you? And Jesus says something here that sounds totally backwards. Because according to every instinct we have within us, the way to preserve and protect the ideal that we have is to protect it with everything we have. And yet Jesus says, look, the thing that you're trying so hard to protect may be the thing that's worth losing in order to clear the way for something that's ultimately greater. So here's the question. The question for us is, what life am I trying to protect? What life am I trying to protect? You ever notice how many people give their entire lives to chasing a version of life that they never actually enjoy when they get there? They chase the promotion and they get it. And then they immediately realize it's not enough. Find popularity with the group in middle school that they've longed for, and then immediately realize there are other groups. They'd rather be friends with them. They get the bigger house and the bigger neighborhood, and then immediately realize that the neighbors in the bigger house and the bigger neighborhood have cooler toys that we can't have because we have the bigger house and the bigger neighborhood. Get the life that they dreamed of. And somewhere along the way, discover that they sacrificed relationships, and peace, and joy, and purpose, and sometimes even their soul in order to get something that doesn't satisfy. See what Jesus is saying here? The way of the cross looks like losing to people who are on track to lose everything. And notice, Jesus isn't describing some abstract spiritual principle here. He's describing a reality that you and I experience every single day. Like you can spend your whole life trying to achieve a life or preserve your life and then wake up one day realizing you never actually lived it. You can gain exactly what you've always wanted and still lose what matters the most. So look, a whole week on an ICU floor will change your perspective. Just looking around on an ICU floor, there are no fancy clothes on anyone. No degrees hanging on the wall. Nobody knows who's rich or who's poor or who built their business from scratch. Nobody asked my dad how many followers he had or what kind of car he drove. Jesus is inviting us not to wait for a moment like that for the reality check. Look, he's not asking whether or not you're capable of gaining the whole world. He's asking if you gain it, will it be enough? And it's not. I mean, look, Elon Musk became the world's first trillionaire on Friday. He can buy the whole world. And he wants Mars. See, the life that Jesus is inviting us to lose is the life that won't satisfy us, that we were never going to be able to keep anyway. And that's where Jesus lands. He fast forwards the tape. Look at verse 38. He says, if anyone's ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Jesus fast forwards the timeline. When the Son of God comes. See, here's what he's saying. Start your life with the end in mind. Don't just wait for the end to get here. He's saying, I don't want you to wait until then to live like then. Because what a shame to get there and to look back and to realize you missed out on what he was doing, what he was up to, what he was showing, where he was leading you, because you just wanted to do you the whole way. And he's not just talking about whether or not you're willing to talk about him with your friends and neighbors. That's sometimes how this verse gets used, to being ashamed of him. I think Jesus is talking about something a lot more core than that. He's inviting us to ask the question, whose approval will I allow to shape the course of my life? Whose approval will I allow to shape my life? Everybody lives for the approval of somebody. When the rapids start raging in the river of life, or the journey feels daunting, all of us are going to listen for the voice of the person that we trust to tell us that we're getting it right. The problem is the voices that compete with the voice of Jesus are rarely obvious, especially in the moment. I mean, sometimes the voices that compete with Jesus is the approval of the crowd. Sometimes it's the expectations of our family. Sometimes it's the voice of the thousands of ads and carefully posed and filtered Instagram posts that say, this is where the good life will be found. And sometimes it's the voice of that pesky inner critic that says, here's what success has to look like. But Jesus is saying, make sure you trust the voice today that you're going to be able to trust forever. I remember talking to Brian Smith, our Alliance congregation pastor, several years ago about the challenge of navigating middle school parenting. And I'll never, ever forget him saying, you know what, I would give anything to go back and to try to convince middle school Brian that in 4 years he will not care what any of these people think anymore. That's definitely something that was true of middle school Chris. Probably college-age Chris. If I'm honest, it's probably a temptation for middle-aged Chris. That the glory that I thought I was chasing, the approval that I felt like I was needing, turned out not to be anywhere close to the top of my priority list just a few years further down the road. But middle school me was as hard to convince as middle-aged me. And I think that's why Jesus isn't trying to convince us to ignore all of the other voices here. He's just calling us to listen for a clearer one that'll be trustworthy all the way through life. But how do we know? See, one of the reasons that it's so scary to trust Jesus in this is it seems like nobody lives like this. I mean, your world doesn't live this way. Your coworkers don't live this way. A lot of our families don't live this way. The popular kids at school don't live this way. Nobody will understand because nobody lives like this. But someone has. See, Jesus isn't the kind of leader that just shouts commands from the shore. He's not the kind of leader that's just guessing at the path. This is not the blind leading the blind here. He's already gone through these rapids. He's already walked the road of self-denial and taken up his cross. He navigated the worst case scenario all the way through to ultimate victory. And commands Jesus gives here aren't commands that he avoided. They're the very path he was walking himself. And he navigated that path so well that, think of it, the primary icon of the Christian faith is not a checkered flag. It's not a corporate ladder. It's not a dollar sign. And it's not even, check it out, a crown or even an empty tomb. The icon of our faith is a cross. Why? Because if Jesus would do this, if Jesus would intentionally walk like this and towards this and through this, he can do anything. And even more, he's proven his commitment to us, and he's earned the credibility in front of us to trust him to guide us well, even through the worst case scenario and on to the ultimate victory of an empty grave. At the end of your story, the end of my story, what kind of story you don't want to live? You want to live a story that looks like everybody else? Or you want to live the kind of story that lives and looks like Jesus? Even if in the moment it doesn't seem like a life that you like, right in the middle of the story. That's the invitation. Jesus looks at all of us, the crowd and his followers, and he says, trust me, follow me. I've been where you're heading, and I can take you where you're wanting to go because I know where real life is found. Would you follow me? Would you bow your head with me? Lord, on a Sunday morning in a place like this, it's easy for us to say yes. Yes, Lord, we see who you are. We see what you've done. We know what you're like. We'll trust you. It's hard. It's hard when the phone call comes on Monday or on Saturday morning. It's hard, Lord, when we walk into an office and nobody lives like you've invited us to live. It's hard, God, when the people in our world and every ad that we see and Instagram vision that gets cast, Lord, feels like something that's so compelling to us in the moment. But Jesus, in this moment, we want to pre-decide. We want to see what's beyond just the moment. We want to look towards the end of the tape, and we want to see, Lord, who you are and what you're like and what you've promised. And we want to say yes, even in the crisis, to taking up the cross and pre-deciding that, Jesus, we will follow you to the end because we know from your example and from your promise what's on the other side of the end. And that you promise to walk with us every step of the way. Lord, I pray for the person that's come in this morning for whatever reason and has never decided to trust you because they're just not sure that you're trustworthy. And they've looked at other people who are struggling to trust you or people that have never trusted you before, and they realize that they're not following really well. But there's something compelling about you. And I pray this morning that they wouldn't dismiss you because of someone else who didn't follow well. But they would look at the life that you live, the life that you promised to give. They would receive the gift of forgiveness that's paid for and hope that's bought with your blood, and the promise that goes beyond an empty grave towards life that's truly life, and that they would receive it right where they sit by telling you that they're just going to draw an X through all of their trying and all of their hustling and all of their dreams, and they're going to trust you with a bigger dream for their life than the one that they've had up to this point. And I pray that, God, for all of us. Some of us that made the first decision to trust you a long, long time ago, before, frankly, life was really messy. Would you meet us again in this place and invite us again today to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and to trust you for life that's truly life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.